So glad to have you here. This is the Reasonable Faith Podcast with Dr. William Lane Craig. Kevin Harris in the studio with Dr. Craig. And Bill, we have some general questions about God that we'd like to address. And one in particular here that came in from Dr. Jamie Watson, who's Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Young Harris College. She says, Dr. Craig, in a response to a question about abstract objects, you argue against a Platonist account of mathematical objects, since Platonism entails the existence of necessary objects independently of God, and since these are inconsistent with John 1:3 and the creedal statements that God created all things visible and invisible. You conclude that Platonism is inconsistent with Christianity. Is that true so far, Bill?
Yes, that's a nice summary.
My concern is this. You seem to assent to a classical account of divine omnipotence, according to which God can do all that is logically possible. And so, I take it that logical inconsistency constitutes an acceptable restriction on God's power. But if this is right, aren't there propositions, for example, P and not P, that are necessarily true independently of God's existence?
Her argument here is that in order to make certain affirmations, the metaphysician is committed to the reality of certain abstract objects called propositions, which would roughly be the information content of sentences. And I think that this is incorrect, this inference. What I think we as Christians want to affirm will be things like the following. We believe that necessarily either God exists or God does not exist. We think necessarily God is good. Necessarily God is eternal. But that doesn't require that you then make what is called a semantic assent to a sort of second level or higher level and say, therefore, it is true that necessarily God exists or God does not exist, or it is true that necessarily God is good. To make that a semantic assent, you have now moved from affirming that necessarily God exists or does not, to no longer affirming that, but to affirming that there is a truth, that there is a proposition which has the value true. And this is to make a semantic assent that is simply unnecessary in order to make these first-level, first-order affirmations about the way God is. So to give a non-theological example, Kevin, I could say Hitler was a really bad man. Or I could ascend semantically and say, it is true that Hitler was a really bad man. Do you see the difference between the first order and the second level claim? And that second level claim doesn't need to be made. I can just say Hitler was a really bad man, and I can make that affirmation sincerely and so forth without ascending semantically to saying, therefore, there is a proposition which has the value true. So I certainly do want to affirm what she says, namely that God necessarily either exists or does not, or God is good, or necessarily God is eternal or omnipotent. But I don't think that commits us to the reality of propositions. Now, if you do want to make these second-order statements, you want to semantically ascend to talking now no longer about God, but rather talking about truths, well, it could be open to the nominalist to identify propositions with, say, God's belief states or something of that sort, and have a kind of conceptualist view. This would be an alternative to Platonism that would ground these truths in the mind of God. But I'm not willing to even go that far yet. I don't see why we even need to be pushed that far. Why not just not make the semantic assent and just content ourselves with affirming that necessarily either God exists or does not, or necessarily God exists and so forth?
Is this sometimes called a modified Platonism or a theistic Platonism?
No, I don't think it is a modified Platonism. Usually that would be a view that there do exist these abstract objects external to God. These are real beings that are not in any way in God's mind or dependent upon his intellect. these are things that are external to God,
You mean
but they are created by God.
you say being, we often think of a personal being when we do that, but you're not talking about a
No,
personal being.
obviously not. I mean,
Yeah.
a tree is a being, a computer is a being, a table is a being,
Yeah.
at least unless you're a mereological nihilist who don't think there are composite objects, but we don't get into that. So the point is that the modified Platonist would affirm that there are these entities, if you like that word better than being, or objects, which exist exterior or outside of God, but are caused or created by God. That's what I would call a kind of modified Platonism.
Okay.
I don't think modified Platonism works because it seems to me that some of these objects are uncreatable. For example, take the property of being powerful. If God has to create properties in order for them to exist, how could he create the property of being powerful without already having the property of being powerful?
Mm-hmm.
In order to create the property, being powerful, God would already need to be powerful. He's got to have some power in order to do that. But then you're in a vicious circle, you see. In order to create the property, he already has to have the property. So it seems to me that modified Platonism is attended by this vicious circle or bootstrapping problem that I don't know how to escape, and therefore I am not enamored with this modified Platonism or absolute creationism, as it's sometimes called. I would rather go to a divine conceptualism, which would identify these things as merely ideas in the mind of God or something of that sort. Or even more so, I'm even more attracted to just a plain old nominalist view that these things just don't exist. That although we can talk about them and they're sort of useful façon de parler, the means of speaking, they don't really exist. They're kind of like Wednesdays. It's useful to talk about Wednesday, and we can say Wednesday is the day of the faculty meeting, or we can say Wednesday is between Tuesday and Thursday, and we assert true things. But nobody thinks that Wednesdays actually exist, that there are these objects that exist in a mind-independent way called Wednesdays. Wednesday seems to be just social constructs, not objective realities. And I suspect that it's similar with these other sorts of abstract objects, that they don't really exist in a robust sort of way.
Now, are we to understand that Plato somehow thought so? That he thought they did?
Yes, he thought that this world of sensory objects, tables and chairs and horses and people, is in a sense a less real reality than the abstract realm on which the sensible realm is modeled. He thought that this world of sense-perceptible objects has a kind of shadowy existence, and that the things that are truly real and existent are these abstract entities which serve as the pattern or the model for these objects of sense that we deal with in this world.
Can we trace the evolution of thinking on that, perhaps to the early church, to the early church fathers, would start to question that?
Most certainly, early church fathers like Origen and Augustine in particular clearly understood that classic Platonism is incompatible with theism because it posits infinite realms of being which are independent of God, exist just as necessarily and uncreatedly as he does, and that these things are not created by God. And therefore it results in a sort of metaphysical pluralism where you have no ultimate reality that is unique. God is not the summit of being, so to speak. There is just a plurality of uncreated ultimate beings of which God is merely one. And so Augustine moved the Platonic realm of the ideas into the mind of God and said these things are merely ideas in the divine intellect. Thomas Aquinas then went even further and said, although we talk as though these are distinct ideas in the mind of God, that's just our way of conceiving them. In fact, God is simple, and there really isn't even a diversity of divine ideas in the way God knows things. That's just the way we represent it to ourselves.
Dr. Watson goes on to say, now, if this is right, doesn't this imply that at least some necessary abstract objects exist independently of God? If this is not problematic for Christianity, then I'm not sure Platonic numbers are. Wouldn't a better interpretation of John 1:3 be that the latter half, apart from him, nothing came into being that came into being, is simply a qualification on the first half, all things came into being through him. So that things that do not come into being, numbers, propositions, moral truths, were not created, but exist eternally and necessarily?
Now, this is a question, Kevin, that I have addressed to a great extent in Question of the Week number 210, which is a kind of preview of a paper I'm going to be giving on this at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting in November in San Francisco. And it's very interesting that the majority view of the editors of the Greek text of the New Testament is that verse 3 does not include that qualifying phrase, that came into being. Rather, the second half of the verse says, apart from him, not one thing came into being. And they punctuate the verse so that it ends there. Now, I think you can make out a case for including the words, not one thing came into being, that has come into being, as part of verse 3, primarily on the basis of the fact that in Middle Platonism, that is to say, Platonism as it had evolved to the time of the first century, had developed a view according to which there are two realms of reality, the sort of intelligible realm of the ideas or the Platonic abstract entities, and then the sensible world of things that become, things that are subject to temporal becoming. So you have the realm of being, and then you have the realm of becoming. And it's possible that what John is talking about is God's creating the realm of things that are in the realm of becoming. But when you look at what Middle Platonists thought about the realm of being, this intelligible realm, they believed that the Platonic ideas all existed in the mind of the divine Logos, the mind of God, so that there isn't any independently existing realm of abstracta. These are ideas in the Logos. And that is exactly the background that you have for the prologue to the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Logos, and was God, and the Logos was God. And then everything else was created through the Logos. This is Middle Platonism. This
Wow.
is exactly what Middle Platonism believed. And so if Jamie is right, that what John 1:3 is talking about is simply God's creation through the Logos of the realm of becoming, that is only because there were no objects existing independently of God in the realm of being. Rather, God and his Logos is the seat of any abstract entities that you might care to posit. These were ideas in the mind of God. So I think even given the inclusion of that phrase that has come into being on the tail end of John 1:3, it would follow that John is thinking of God here as the sole uncreated being who exists a se through himself, and that all other things belong to the realm of becoming, which was brought into existence through the agency of the Logos. The Johannine prologue reflects the background of Middle Platonism. It breathes the same atmosphere that these Middle Platonists breathe, people like Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher and exegete. But John does not, unlike Philo, explicitly teach that abstract objects are ideas in the Logos. John's interest is in salvation. His interest is in the incarnation. And so he quickly moves to the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have beheld his glory, and so forth. He doesn't tarry or linger on the pre-creatorial state of the Logos and whether or not the divine ideas are there. So I don't think we can say that John or the Bible teach that abstract objects are ideas in the mind of God. That would be to be reading between the lines.
Okay.
But I think what we can say is that such a view is consonant or consistent with what the Bible is teaching. And I think we could also say that in the minds of the author of the Johannine prologue, that God is the only uncreated being, that he does think of God as the sole uncreated being that exists a se, and that everything else came into existence through the Logos. I think we can say that he teaches that.